so we have our first initial stage sculpt of our prop here, and it's looking pretty good. Now, there is an issue with this in that if we wanted to take this further with texturing and even high-res sculpting, we're going to run into some issues because we used this dynamic topology setting. Now, dynamic topology is great for creating these organic forms, and I personally find that using a dynamic topology lends to your better overall shapes, so your end result will be better, but it does leave us with this sort of very dense mesh, very messy mesh here. Now, you may be wondering, well, what is the problem with this? Well, the problem is, one, if this was a character that needed to be animated, there's just no way the computer could handle animating this. And the second problem here is that when it is time to go to apply textures to this to give it, this final stone look, adding textures and materials to it, we're going to have a really, really hard time doing that because we need to go through a process called UV unwrapping, which sort of depends on having cleaner lines than this. So before we move forward with this piece, we need to retopologize it. Now, retopology is the process of simplifying a complex 3D model into a sort of a lower resolution, simplified mesh of easier polygons. And this is achieved by modeling a new mesh with fewer polygons over the existing sculpt. So essentially, we're going to rebuild this piece using simpler forms. So let's just get started with the retopology itself. Now, there's a lot of paid tools to help speed this up because it is quite a long and tedious process at times, especially for very complex or very large pieces. But we're not going to use those. We're just going to do it by hand so you understand the basics of how this works. So we're going to essentially start with build a new mesh over this, but we're going to follow the forms that we have created with our sculpt so that our end result will be a low res version of this, but it's going to conform much more nicely to our shape here. And we will end up with slight detail loss, but then we are going to take our retopologized model back into a high res and sculpt some of this really fine, like this stone detail and things like that on it. So let's get started there. So the way I typically start with retopology is we're in object mode right now here, and you want to be in object mode because we want to add a new object to this scene. So let's press Shift and A and add a plane to our scene here. So basically this plane, it's a single quad face, and it's going to be the jumping off point for building this thing by hand. So I'm going to move it to the front of the face here, and I'm just going to move it right to I'm going to move the pivot point of it right to where the brow is. I'm going to press R while I'm in right orthographic view to just rotate it along that single axis. And then press S to scale it down so it's approximately, the size of our brow here. Okay, so with the plane selected, let's just go ahead and rename these really quick just for clarity. I'm going to rename my sculpt piece Sculpt. I just did that by double clicking. You can also press F2. And I'm going to name that one Retopo. Okay, so again, this sculpted piece is still mirrored, and everything that we do in retopology is going to be essentially a function of modeling. So we can use a mirror modifier on this retopology plane here to save ourselves essentially half of the work. So I'm just going to come into edit mode. I'm going to press Control and R to add an edge loop. And then I'm just going to select the two vertices on the left here, press X and delete them. So I'm left with half my mesh with this pivot point, this origin, right in the center along the line of symmetry. I don't know if I mentioned this in the video I did on modeling because our modeling session was so brief, but you definitely need to have your pivot point, your origin, this orange dot, along your line of symmetry in order for the mirror to work correctly. So if my origin was, say, over here, which I can do by selecting this point, pressing Shift S on my keyboard, selecting cursor to selected. This will bring my 3D cursor, which we have not really discussed up until this point, but it is basically, it is a cursor that you can use to assign, points to different areas. You can use this as a temporary pivot point. There's lots of things you can do with 3D cursor, but we can snap it to this point by pressing Shift and S and pressing cursor to selected. And now if I tab back into object mode, I right click on my plane here and I say set origin to 3D cursor. Well, you can see that my pivot point has snapped here, but it also has snapped to my mirror. So now it is mirroring across this line of symmetry instead of this one. So apologies for not covering this sooner, but we do need our origin or our pivot to be aligned with our line of symmetry here. So to get this back, I'm just going to select both these points on the left side, and I'm going to do the same process. I'm going to press Shift and S, select cursor to selected, tab back into object mode, right click, set origin, origin to 3D cursor. Okay, so there's a couple more things we really need to do in order for this to work smoothly. The first thing we need to do is turn on snapping. Now, we discussed snapping in relation to the grid many times, but there are other forms of snapping that we can use in Blender. And the one we're going to use for retopology is we are going to use face snapping. So in the drop down here, select face. And we also want to select project individual elements. So what this will do is that now if I tab into edit mode, every time I move a point here, let me move to the side so you can see what it's doing. If I press G to move this point, it's automatically going to snap to the nearest face that it can detect. So it's going to snap to this sculpt underneath it here, which will allow us to basically build up a form over this that perfectly matches it. Now, to further refine how this plane gets snapped, we're going to add another modifier here. So come into the modifier stack. Again, this is in the plane itself, the retopology plane, not the sculpt. In the retopology plane, we're going to come and add a modifier here underneath the mirror, and that's going to be a shrink wrap modifier. So it's under the deform panel, select shrink wrap. Now, what shrink wrap is going to do is similar to this snapping here, but it's just going to help it conform a little better. I do find that you typically need both of these enabled to get a good retopology. So we're going to do both. And we're also going to enable clipping here in the mirror because our center points were sort of coming over to the other side. Now, for shrink wrap to work properly, we have to tell this plane what we want it to shrink wrap onto, and that's what this target field here is for. So you'll notice that the shrink wrap icon is red right here. If you have a modifier that has a red icon, that means that the modifier is present, but it's not currently doing anything because you're missing some sort of input. So the input we need is this sculpt piece. So we can either select it from the drop down here or grab the eyedropper and select it in the world. And that will turn the icon white, and we know that the shrink wrap is working. So now we have our points are snapping, but we also cannot really move our retopology away from the mesh as well because it is at 2 points trying to conform to the shape of this piece. Now, however, this is working and this is what we want, but it's not, we can't really see what's happening here. So within the retopology, again, we're going to come into object properties and we're going to scroll down to where it says viewport display here. And in this menu, we're going to select in front, and that's just going to push our retopology to the front, at least for the purposes of visualization. It's not actually moving our mesh at all, but it's just rendering it as being in front so that we can see it, even if we, come around the back here. So that's just going to help us with our visualization. The next thing I need to do in order for this to go smoothly is I want to cull the back faces. So we haven't talked too much about back faces, but let me just hide this sculpt for the time being. So right now I have just a single plane here. It's one-sided. However, I can see both sides of it currently. Now, the way that polygons work in any 3D program is that one face is considered to be facing forward and one is considered to be facing backwards. We can visualize this by coming up to our viewport overlays and turning on face orientation. Anything that is facing forwards will be rendered in blue, and anything that is facing backwards will be rendered in red. Now you may be asking yourself, what is the point of this? Well, if you have sort of your back face is facing forward, things are not going to render properly when it comes to applying textures, especially if they're transparent and things like that. You're going to get a lot of shading errors. So we need to make sure at all times that when we have a closed object, such as this one, that we cannot see any red in it, and that all these faces are facing forward. Because if we move to the inside, we'll see that the red faces are all in the back. So as I said before, we have rendered this retopology plane as being in front of this, which is great for when we're viewing it from this angle, but when we are trying to retopologize the back of this, it's going to get very confusing as to what is part of the face and what is part of the back of the head. So basically what we want to do is to tell Blender that any of these sort of red backwards facing faces, we just don't want to see them at all when we're flipped around. So what we need to do is turn on back face culling. To do that, we're going to come up to the viewport shading options here, and we're going to click this drop down here. This is going to give us like a lot of options for how we want to visualize our mesh in the viewport. It won't affect the final appearance of our mesh itself. It's just to help us with visualizations. But what I'm going to do is come in here and turn on back face culling. So that way, even though this is rendered as being in front of our sculpt, when I come around here, we see the outline, but we don't actually see these faces anymore. So that's just going to help us when we get around to the back of the head. The last thing we can do to help with our visualization as we are retopologing is to turn on random shading. So what this is also a viewport shading option. So if we click the drop down here and under here where it says color, if we select random, what this will do is it will randomly assign a color to every distinct object in our scene. So because the retopology plane and the sculpt piece are two distinct objects, they each get a different color. So it just helps with your visualization as you move forward with this. It can be a little difficult when everything is rendered in that same flat gray color to see what's going on. Okay, so we're ready really to start retopologizing our mesh here. So we have the basis here, which is going to be this plane. So with the plane selected, let's come into edit mode by pressing tab, and that will give us the verts here. Now we talked a little bit about how to add and subtract different amounts of geometry from basic models, but we're going to use a new function, and that is called the extrude function. So the extrude function is basically just going to pin on additional faces from whatever you have selected. So with this edge selected, all we have to do is press E to extrude, and then we can drag out new faces. And since we have both a shrink wrap modifier and and face snapping enabled, we know that as we pull these out, it is going to conform to the shape of our sculpt here. So basically all we have to do to retopologize this is to continue to pull these forms out in a way that conform to the underlying shape. So we want the edges, the edge loops, to follow these creases and these bumps here, which will enable us to have a really good, clean, high-resolution sculpt once we are done. So I think the best way to learn how to retopologize is to just do it. So I'm just going to continue on and try to explain what I'm doing as I'm doing it. So I'm going to press E to extrude here to create new faces. And I'm just grabbing these points by selecting them and pressing G to move them around. So I basically just want to match the arch of this eyebrow here. And it's really important in retopology that you keep your faces as all quads, so meaning, you know, a face with 4 sides. If you recall, our dynamic topology sculpt underneath here is all triangles, which is fine for the most part, but it is what is preventing us from being able to animate it or to have really good UVs on it. It just makes selection kind of a nightmare. So we want to keep really clean quad geometry. We want to keep clean edge loops, and we want to follow the forms of these loops based on our underlying sculpt. And if it's helpful, you can always look up like retopology guides. You know, you can just do like a Google image search and they will show you sort of CG faces with the guides for how the edge loops should flow together. So I grabbed this edge here and I'm just pulling down for the nose. So we're getting some errors here with the shrink wrap modifier. So if you ever get, you know, a point that is snapping like through the mesh to the opposite side, just change the angle of your view camera here and grab that point again, and it should snap to where you want it to go. So the thing about retopology is we want to keep the number of points we are using as low as possible, but if we go too low, we won't be getting the curves we need. So like this nose is quite curved here, but we need more geometry along here in order to match that. So it's really sort of just a balancing act between fidelity with the underlying mesh and like performance. So I'm going to enable this on cage option here in the shrink wrap modifier because it's going to allow me to more accurately see what is going on with my mesh. You can see the difference if I deselect it, it is showing sort of the mesh, how it is being deformed without the vertices drawn on top of it. It's a little bit hard to explain, but if you select on cage here, it will draw the vertices exactly on top of the mesh as they're being deformed by the modifier. You can see when I add in an edge loop with Control R and double clicking, it automatically snapped. I'll undo it to show you again. So I have this straight line here, but I want to follow this curve more closely. So all I did here is hit Control and R and double click. And because of the modifiers I have enabled, it automatically conformed to the shape of that nose. Now, the thing about retopology is it's not possible to match this exactly without having an insane number of vertices. So it's just about matching it as closely as you can while maintaining a manageable number of faces. Again, I'm just hitting the E to extrude these out, and then shifting the points around individually with the G key here. And I think you can kind of see how this is going to come together as I add more faces. You can kind of see the form that this retopologized mesh is going to take. You can see how it conforms to the sculpt. So in order to match these forms really closely, it's really important that you have edges on the low points and the high points here. Otherwise, you will not be able to match the form properly. So anywhere where there's a crease, definitely have an edge there. Anywhere where there's like a raised, like a curve, definitely have an edge there. And then areas that have less detail here are gonna have larger quads, but we will address that when we get there. So I'm just following the form of the brow, and then it sort of forms down into this cheekbone here. So I want to extend these faces down and then sort of rejoin them somewhere up here. Okay, so the trickiest part about retopology is how to join up the faces that you've created with each other. So you always want to be mindful of that as you're building out your forms, is where are these going to join back into the mesh. So for here, this is pretty straightforward. We're going to select these 4 points and we're going to press F to fill them in with a face. So that forms a nice clean 4-sided quad right here, but as you continue, you'll get sort of areas of strange pinching and things like that. So you just want to be mindful of how these things are going to join back in. So I'm going to select this edge right here, and I'm going to hit E to extrude it out. And I'm going to push these points into this crease right here. And then I'm going to use an add-on to fill these. So add-ons are basically just script extensions of Blender. They can be accessed by coming into the Edit menu, going to Preferences, and then coming over here to Add-ons. Now, there are tons and tons and tons of add-ons that come ready to go with Blender. Anything that has already been enabled by default, leave enabled. But there are lots of things that are disabled that are already packaged in with Blender that basically can speed up workflows, they can extend functionality, there's all sorts of things that add-ons can do. And you can even install add-ons from third parties that you download off the internet. Lots of people, anyone can develop an add-on for Blender and publish it because, again, it is an open source tool. But the one we're going to look at is the F2 add-on. So up in the search bar right here, go ahead and type in F2, and you'll get a result here that says Mesh F2. Now this is packaged in with Blender. You should not have to download it at all. And you can read about what it does here, but it's basically a really useful tool for retopologizing. So go ahead and click the checkbox to enable it, and then close out the preferences window. So what this will do, it will allow me to select a vert in the corner here, and just press F and it will create a quad for it. So it's really helpful for maintaining quadded geometry here. So I'm going to tweak these up because I want this edge to follow this line that's created from the corner of the eye here. Oops. Just grab that and tweak it, move it. The other thing to note about retopology is that you want to maintain like even quads where you can. So you want to avoid, for the most part, certain areas being super dense and other areas being not so dense. Now, there are exceptions to this rule. Obviously, you need more detail in the face than we're going to need in the back of the head. So that's okay, but as far as like when you're looking at loops, you do not want like one edge to be like this, where you have these really tight rectangles going vertically and then have these long stretched out faces next to it. It's just going to cause shading and subdivision issues when we go into finish our sculpting for this section. So I think I want to tweak this one here. We may need another edge right here to form in here for this crease, but we can always add in loops later. So I'm just going to connect these like that for now. So I'm going to press E to just extrude this single point out to create an edge right here. And that's going to allow me to select this inner corner right here and press F to create a whole quad. And then I can just follow that all the way around this edge as well. And again, if you want a more in-depth, sort of a slower paced course on Blender and its functionalities, if you've never used Blender before, I do recommend the Blender Mega course, of which I taught the Blender Basics section. I am assuming sort of, not necessarily Blender knowledge, but sort of basic familiarity with some concepts of CG here. And I think because this is a project-based course, I'm really only focused on giving you the tools that you need to do a project such as this. But there's a lot more to Blender. It has a lot more functionality than this. And if you're interested, I definitely recommend checking that out. So you can already start to see how this retopology mesh is starting to conform to the shapes that we made with our dynamic topology sculpt. So retopology is sort of a slow process here, but I think it's worth it. And of course, if you do this, I recommend doing this once by hand, and if you just can't stand it, there are tools out there to sort of speed this up, and there are even tools to automate this process. However, most of them are paid, so I think it's best for the purposes of this course to go through how to do it by hand for those people that cannot necessarily afford, you know, expensive plugins for Blender. I'm actually going to pull these in just a little bit here because I want one more loop going through. So now I've created what's called an edge loop, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's just a loop, a closed loop of edges here that when I hold Alt and select an edge, it will select the whole thing. And so I can select the whole thing with Alt, and from here I can press extrude and scale to scale in further. And that just speeds up time when you're doing like lots of concentric edge loops. It's best to form one and then extrude the whole thing in. It just saves some time. Okay, so we have 14 points that go along this loop, and the reason I'm counting them is I'm trying to see if I can use what is called a grid fill function here. So this is another sort of method for saving time during retopology, is if you have to fill a large patch that is, you know, more or less flat, we can use what is called a grid fill function. So the way that this works is we can select our edge loop. Now, grid fill is only going to work with 2 or more edge loops. So we're going to have to deselect 2 points here. So let's deselect this one and this one in the corner. Actually, let's deselect this one in the corner. They don't have to be perfectly even, but they definitely works better if they are. So let's see if this one will work with this sort of configuration. So we're going to press space on our keyboard to pull up the search function. And if you recall, when we first set up Blender, we bound the space bar to search instead of play. If you did not, you'll have to find the search function for whatever it is bound to for you. But we have it bound to the space bar, and we're just going to type in the word grid fill, and we're going to use this grid fill function right here. So once I select it, you'll see immediately what it does is that it fills in as best as it can based on what you have selected here. It fills in the mesh with a grid. Now, of course, there's different settings you can do for this. So if I were to do this function again, you'll notice down here I get this little like last operation menu. So anything that appears, any menus that appear down here are related to the last operation you performed. And if I click away, I lose the menu. So before we click away, we can expand this menu down here into and see what the options for that particular function are. We have span and offset here. So span basically will not work for this in particular case, but it's how many divisions of this grid that you want. Because this is so small, we can only use one, but if we had a very large swath of grid here, we could increase the number of subdivisions in it. Offset, additionally, is not going to work here because of the types we have selected, but if you get some sort of twisting in your grid fill, setting the offset up or down should help with that. But this one was pretty straightforward. We didn't give it a lot of room for error, so we can be satisfied with this. Now we do have a triangle here because we weren't perfectly even. So let's try to fix this. So I'm just going to select these and I'm going to delete the faces. I'm just basically going to shift the triangle over here because I think it's a little bit cleaner and it matches this corner here. So we want to try to maintain all quads where we can, but there will be certain areas where it's just not possible or it doesn't make sense to have quadded geometry. And in those cases, triangles are okay. You just want to be very sparing with them and you want to be very careful about where you place them. So all I'm doing here is I'm selecting the vertices and pressing F to fill those in with faces. Okay, so we are at about 30 minutes for this video, so we're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to finish the retopology. Okay, so this is where we are currently at with our retopology progress. We've gotten a good chunk of the face done, and for this video, we're just going to resume our retopology using the same methods that we discussed in the previous video. So again, those methods are mostly about extruding individual edges here to conform to the form of the underlying sculpt. So let's just proceed with this process. Again, in order to make sure we have all our verts easily manipulatable, all I'm doing right here is just pressing G and moving these vertices around. But because I have both the shrink wrap modifier set up and the global snapping, the face snapping set up, this process should go fairly quickly. So I'm just going to proceed by coming down the cheek line here from this edge. So I'm just hitting E again to extrude and pressing G to tweak these vertices when I feel that they need to change their position slightly. If you do not want to have to press G every time you need to tweak a point, you can also change the type of selection that you have set up. So by default, your selection is defaulted to box selection, which is represented by the box in the toolbar on the left here. Now, I know I haven't discussed the left-hand toolbar very much when it comes to modeling. We talked about it more when it comes to sculpting, and that is simply because I'm teaching you the hotkeys for these functions when they have them. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this process, I'm really only going to be covering the types of things that I would use to create a model like this, and we will be discussing more, complex functions as we go. But because this is a project-based course, I'm not going to, be going over every single one of these tool functionalities in detail. That's something that you can do on your own time, or if you take my Blender Basics course, that it covers these things in more detail. However, most of these common functionalities here have hotkeys, which is what I use and what I will be teaching because it makes for faster work. Okay, so let's connect these right here. I'm just going to select all of them and press F to fill. But sorry, as I was saying, the selection we have right here is defaulted to box select. If we click and hold on this, we have some options here for the types of selections we can use. and one of them is tweak select. So basically what this does is when you click and drag on a point, instead of creating a box selection, what it's going to do is just going to move that point. So if you find that this is easier for retopology to just click and drag to tweak these points, that's perfectly valid to use. I tend to use the G key because I like to be able to select multiple points at once. Okay, so let's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, so for this patch right here, this is a good example of when to use a grid fill. So in order for this to work, we have to be careful about our selection here. So I believe there's 18 points going all the way around. So I think it will be easiest if we deselect this point and this point here. So let's press spacebar to pull up our search function, and let's type in grid. And we can see here that the shortcut for the grid fill is Control F. I just frequently forget. So sometimes it's easier just to search it. Okay, so we're getting some errors here with our grid fill. And that's because these edges were not perfectly even. So let's go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3. So it just takes a little bit of experimenting. I do find that the grid fill works best when you have the same number of points on each side of your selection. But you may still get errors such as this. So let's just Control Z to undo this, and let's hit Control F and select grid fill. And some of this is just a matter of trial and error, unfortunately. Let's add one more cut here and slide this up. So the edge slide function that I just did is accomplished by double tapping G on the keyboard. So you press G once to move freely, but if you press it again before you drop it, you'll get this edge slide functionality, which allows you to sort of redistribute edges along their face. Okay, so the grid fill is not really working for this area, but that's okay, we can fill it in by hand. So that's another neat trick here is if you have sort of an obvious quad right here, typically if you grab one edge of it and press F, it will fill the quad automatically. It's not a perfect algorithm. Sometimes Blender does have a hard time interpreting what exactly you are trying to fill. And so if that ever does not work properly, you can always manually select all 4 points and hit F to fill in the face. So what I mean by that is here I have sort of this blank area here, but very obviously we should be able to fill it with one quad right here, one quad right here, and one quad right here. So Blender is thankfully smart enough that if I select these 2 points on the end here and just press F 3 times, it will fill them completely in. So I do think that we are going to have a triangle here, but that is okay in this case. Let's grab this inner corner and press F, remembering that this functionality is a product of the F2 add-on, which I covered how to enable that in the previous video. So I'm just taking a moment to think about how I want to resolve this area here. Now, since this face is not going to have any sort of facial animations, we can definitely get away with more triangles than we would if this were a character. So I want to probably add an edge loop in here to get a better curve on this chin here. And I do want to grab this edge and extrude it out and eventually connect here so that I can start filling in this area. The most difficult part of retopology is going from areas of higher resolution and higher detail, such as these eyes, to areas of lower detail, such as the cheeks, which are relatively flat. It's areas like that where you tend to get triangles and bowls and sort of interesting geometry. But you can kind of think of retopology as sort of a puzzle, and it's just about getting the best geometry for the shape. And sometimes that means you do have to make a few compromises in things like having triangles. So this is an area that's going to cause us some interesting issues right here. Because we're going from a small pinched area to a larger area, we're going to need to increase the number of quads we have going this way. So the best way, I think, to increase your number of quad loops is by using a diamond shape. So basically what a diamond shape is, it is a quad piece of geometry, but it doesn't quite follow the standard quad format. You typically want to group 3 of the points together up like this and 1 together like this. So this is your area of increased geometry, and so you have 2 quad loops coming off of these 2 edges, and then you have decreased geometry on this side. So we're gonna have to do something like that here in order to get enough faces to cover this area. The unfortunate thing about creating diamonds is that they usually create either triangles or poles. Poles are areas such as this one right here, where we have a point that has 5 edges coming off of it instead of 4. This is what is known as a pole. These can also cause problems for things like facial animation, which again, we do not really have to worry about with this particular piece. But if this were a character that needed to speak and emote, we would want to be very careful about where we place these. Typically, you want to place them on areas like the cheek or the temple that don't have a lot of deformation when the character is speaking or moving their eyes. So typically any area of the mesh that needs to be animated, you want to keep really clean loops, such as these loops around the eyes. But we can talk more about that when we talk about creating our character mesh. For now, let's just proceed onward with this. So I actually want to merge this point to this point, because I don't want this sort of funny gap here. So the way I would do that in Blender is with the merge vertices function, which you can access by simply pressing M on your keyboard. It's going to give you this merge menu here, and you can choose how you would like to merge the vertices. The center will obviously merge them halfway between the 2 points. At the cursor, we'll merge them wherever your 3D cursor is. And if you remember, at the beginning of our retopology process, we placed our 3D cursor up here at the brow, so obviously we don't want that one. We can merge them at first, which would merge it at this point right here, or at last, which would merge it at this point right here, because that's the last one we had selected. So I'm going to press M and select at last to snap that point down here. And we do have a triangle here, but again, that's okay in this particular case. This is a really good area to create another diamond because we already have this point coming in like this. So now we can create some quads coming off this way, and we can merge this one again. And then we can also have some quads coming up this way along the mouth from here. I want to make sure I have the edge. This edge is going to continue down this way because I want to make sure I maintain this sort of outer edge for the lip. So I'm just going to extrude the edge out instead of the entire face. And I'll worry about filling in the faces after. I also want to maintain this edge going along the inner sort of crevice that forms the mouth. So we just want to be mindful of that as we're creating these quads. Oops. And press F to fill this in. Now my F2 add-on miscalculated where my intention was to form that quad. It formed it here, and we just sort of had this floating edge. So I've just filled in the triangle manually, and now to make this into a quad, I'm going to select this edge. I'm going to right click and hit subdivide to form that last fourth point here. Okay, so I'm going to connect this one to this one by selecting it and pressing F. And we'll have sort of a thinner quad right here. That will leave us with one more triangle. So we're kind of getting a little bit more triangles in this piece than I would typically like. But I think what I'm going to do is just press on because I think it's more important to get this done. And we can come and clean up those triangles if they're causing problems for us later. So occasionally, at certain points in my retopology, I like to just hide my sculpt just to see how it's looking without any distraction. And you can see already that we're maintaining a lot of these forms with a much, much lower density mesh here, which is exactly what we want. Retopology serves a few purposes for us. One, it helps us form a better high resolution sculpt, but it also helps us form our final low poly piece. So I'm not sure if I went into enough detail explaining this before, but something like our sculpt here, although it looks very nice, it is much too dense to really run and render in a game engine at real time. Now, of course, with things like Nanite introduced in Unreal Engine 5, this becomes much easier to handle. And in fact, Unreal probably could handle this density of geometry. However, we would have no way to texture it properly unless we were using something like a tiling texture, which for this piece we are not. We're first going to talk about how to create unique textures because I think it makes the learning process just a little bit more straightforward if you're not familiar with asset creation already. So we're going to talk about unique textures first before we get into tiling textures. And then we'll move on from there. So if you intended to have just a generic stone tiling texture, you probably could use your high resolution sculpt here. But you might get some shading errors, and I think it's just sort of better to learn it this way. So I have sort of an issue here where I have a 5-sided polygon, so I can't just fill this in, because anything that has more than 4 sides, you're going to get some issues with the shading again. So I just need to figure out the most optimal way to fill this area in, and depending on the shape of your mesh, sometimes the most optimal way is just to add an edge loop here. So adding this edge loop solves my problem in that I now have 6 points to work with, which is easier, which is slightly easier to work with, and it's also eliminated, it's turned this triangle into a quad. So we have a quad right here. And I actually think I'm gonna just extrude these in by hitting E and then S to scale it. And then we get a few snapping errors here, which is no problem. We can just manually fix them by grabbing the points. And that's just gonna give us better definition on the inside of this nostril before we fill this in. So I'm just going to press F to connect across this way, fill in this quad, and fill in the last quad here. So now we have all quads and we still have a nice defined nose. Okay, so I'm gonna continue on my retopology from this brow point right up here by pressing E, of course, to extrude. And whatever method you find is easiest for manual retopology is largely, it's a matter of personal preference. I like to grab these corners and hit F because it sort of forces me to maintain quads. Whereas sometimes when you're using other methods, you can be creating triangles and not even really realize it. So that edge slide technique that I mentioned earlier, that works by double tapping G, it also works with individual points. So I can grab any individual point, double tap G, and slide it along its edge. So I was getting some errors there, so I'm just going to extrude this point. What I was trying to do is select this point and form a quad right here, but I was getting some snapping errors. So if that ever happens, a good workaround for that is to just extrude the individual point, which will create an edge, which you then can select all 4 and press F to fill it. This, I think, makes the most sense as a triangle. So because we are using a mirror modifier, it is actually not understanding what I am trying to fill if I select this and press F, because you have to remember that this side is a sort of generated side. So the best way to fill something like this is to actually extrude it, and maybe it is better to do a diamond like that. So we need to maintain this line of symmetry, so we don't want any faces that span the center here. And same thing for this point. I'm just going to extrude towards the X, remembering that I have clipping enabled in this case, so it will not extend past it. And here we can fill this in. So we've completed the entire face here. I think I'm going to take the rest of this retopology off camera because it is a lot of just pressing F and filling in faces, but I think you get the idea. The important things to remember is that you want your retopology to conform to the lines that you've created in your sculpt. So if I grab this off to the, oops, I'm just going to duplicate this really fast just to show you, because I need to apply this shrink wrap modifier in order to move this. So if I move this off to the side here, you can see that compared to what we started with before we sculpted, we have relatively low density of polygons here that are really easy to manage, and we have a much closer shape to what we want our final result to be. So I'm going to wrap up this video right here. I'm going to finish the back of the head and the ears off camera because it is more of the same techniques. And when we come back, we'll talk about where we go from here.